This presentation is going to be abbreviated. Let me tell you a little bit about why we're doing this. Many of you have experience with PPPs, number one. Number two, you've just had a very, very good case on PPPs, so you already know a little bit about it. But when we designed this presentation that I'm going to give right now, we felt it was very, very important for those who don't have experience with PPP to at least have some basic understanding. And this is what we call leveling the playing field so that everybody is on the same page. And this is especially important because although you've done one case on something like a PPP of prisons, we have two more cases on PPPs, and we want to make sure that everybody has the right basic level of understanding about this. So call this PPP 101, and it will be a little bit repetitious for some of you, so I apologize in advance. But I do think it's important because I think that there is a fair amount of misunderstanding about this terminology. And so what we're going to try and do is give you a little bit of the basics of the terminology and what it means and trying to clarify some of the misunderstandings. So what I'd like to do this morning is to first ask the question, what can you use PPP for? And there's an obvious answer, which I'll give you in a minute. But what is eligible for a PPP type of a structure? And before we go too far, and it was talked about a little bit this morning, but I still believe there is some confusion, which is important to clarify, between two terms that you use in Brazil and all over the world a lot. And they're not exactly the same. What is the difference between the term privatization and the term PPP? There are similarities, but there are distinct differences, which I think are important to understand. Why are governments attracted to PPPs? The answer to that question is fairly obvious. You talked about it in the first case this morning. There are some very, very good reasons why governments are motivated to do PPPs, but let's just review what those reasons are. But more importantly, what is the division of responsibility once a government decides that it wants to do a PPP of anything from a prison to a railroad to a toll road? How do you define the division of responsibilities between the government and the private sector, the private contractor? And this is where the problems come up. And let me just say at the outset that we think that there are very, very good reasons to do PPPs for the government, which we'll discuss this morning. But it's intriguing and somewhat mystifying as to, although it may make perfect sense to do a PPP, whether it's a prison, a road, a hospital, whatever, the empirical experience, not only in Brazil, but all over the world, is more often than not, they fail. They don't succeed. Why don't PPPs succeed more often if they're so obviously they make good sense for both the government and the private sector? We'll talk a little bit about the stakeholders. We always have to talk about the stakeholders, and the stakeholders are different depending on what we're talking about, what the sector is, what the project is. But let's just identify again who some of the stakeholders are. And this will become very important, for example, when we talk about our next two PPP cases. This afternoon we're going to do Taiwan high-speed rail, and then on Thursday we're going to talk about a bus terminal PPP in Indonesia. Very, very different, but lots of similarities. And so stakeholder analysis is always important. And finally, and we don't talk enough about this is critically important when you talk about PPPs, is the financial structure. I'm not talking so much about something like a service, like a prison PPP, but if you're doing a toll road, any type of infrastructure, any type of capital-intensive infrastructure project, for example, like Taiwan high-speed rail and so forth, you have to have a basic understanding of the financing and the financial structure. You don't have to be a finance expert, you don't have to know a lot about finance, but you should have a little bit of an understanding, it seems to me, about the financing, which is actually quite complicated, but I think we can simplify it today. So the first question is, what is eligible for a PPP? And the short answer to that for the government, as a government person, is almost anything can be you saw this morning, you could do it with a prison, although it's highly controversial. In principle, theoretically, any government service, any public good service, it can be a candidate for PPP. And then any capital-intensive physical infrastructure project, whether it be a road, electricity, water, also. So we have to get much, much more specific than just to say PPP, because almost anything could be, theoretically, a PPP candidate, and theoretically, it might make sense to do a PPP. So we don't get very far in our understanding if we just say, what can we do a PPP for? But before we talk about PPPs, which is the subject this morning, what is the difference between the term privatization and PPP? And there is a distinct difference. So what is privatization that distinguishes it from virtually every type of PPP we talk about? There's one word that distinguishes privatization from PPP. Control. That's one way to look at it. Control. And what makes it control? What gives you control? Ownership. Equity. The word equity means ownership. And if you have a majority of the equity, you control the asset indefinitely. And this makes privatization different than PPP. So you have not only, in PPP you have control, but almost by definition. By definition, you have control for a limited period of time. If it's the prison and it's 5 years, fine. If it's the Taiwan high-speed rail, it's 35 years. But you don't own it outright. You have some form of a contract to build it, perhaps, operate it, perhaps, but the government still retains long-term control, whereas in privatization, the government is selling a state-owned asset to the private sector, and it's over. And I think this distinction is quite important, and we have to keep it in mind. So when we go ahead, very good question. We call it a golden share in English, and so sometimes, and that we use this sometimes, if the government privatizes something and gives majority control to the private owner, they may, in some instances, retain one share. But that's called a golden share. And if the private owner does X, Y, or Z that the government thinks is not in the public interest, they can respond. And it's a very, very important caveat. So it's used not very often anymore, but the golden share concept, I think, is an important concept. So, but there is this question of ownership, I think, which is very important. This morning we talked about prisons, and that is a service contract. And so that is one type of PPP. I keep confusing the two words. And that would be like these terms are very similar and they're a little bit overlapping, but we should be clear that when we talk about PPPs, there are different types of contracts. Every PPP entails a contract between the government and the private sector, who is the contractor or sometimes called the concessionaire. But they are different. And so sometimes we talk about contracting out a service, a very simple service that the government will do. Why do they do it? It's not so much to save money as it is to do something more efficiently. So it could be cleaning the parks. And there's a view that if you give it to a private contractor who specializes in this, this is not something the government has an expertise in. So there's an efficiency gain, even if there isn't a cost gain. The same thing with an airport. In Brazil, you have already done this. You have management contracts to run the airports. Why? Because there's the perception that this private specialist, this private company that specializes in management of airports, maybe in Brazil, maybe all over the world, is going to do a better job. So it isn't so much of a financial motivation on the part of the government as it is an efficiency motivation on the part of the government. And then there are what we'll call concessions. And herein there is a financial as well as an efficiency gain that motivates the government. And we often call these build, operate, transfer. And this is very, very important again, because it gets back to this distinction between the government, between privatization and PPP. So you have a concession where the government, in the case of Taiwan high-speed rail, or in the case of the Indonesia bus terminal, you select a private contractor to build the physical facility, to manage and operate it, but eventually there is the transfer back to government, or at least the possibility. So the contractor, the concessionaire, does not have outright ownership indefinitely of that asset, and it's a critical distinction. So, it's not a privatization, because the private concessionaire is not going to own that, over the long term. And so I think these are distinctions that you have to keep in mind when you talk about PPPs. Why they do it? Why does the government do it? And again, the answers are fairly obvious. And they are they make a lot of sense. Regardless of whether it's a prison, a road, a railroad, electricity, water, oftentimes the government simply does not have the expertise to run that operation. And that is, I think, one of the main drivers of all these PPPs. It's an efficiency issue. It's that this is not something the government has the capacity to do very, very well. And this again gets back to what Professor Fukuyama was talking about yesterday, where he was talking about state capacity. And we're going to come back to this over and over again, state capacity. The government has limited capacity to do things well. And so it has to be very discriminating about what it's going to do with its limited resources and its limited capacity relative to other things that it has to do. And those are judgment calls. But certainly the government is motivated often to do a PPP of one kind or another because it lacks the expertise. Secondly, money. Especially when we talk about capital-intensive projects like Taiwan high-speed rail, like a toll road, like building a new airport, there is a financial constraint. And so there is often a financial motivation on the part of the government to do that. And as I said, the private sector is deemed to be able to do it more efficiently. And it's very, very important. I think this is interesting in Brazil, for example, is what we call the demonstration effect. Signaling to the public, signaling to everybody that the government is going to do less, the private sector is going to do more, that the government is committed to transferring resources and responsibilities for certain types of activities from the public sector to the private sector. And throughout the last 20 years or 25 years in Brazil, this has been important. that various governments in Brazil have tried to shift resources and responsibility to the private sector for a variety of different reasons. And so every time there's a privatization or an attempt to privatize, you're sending a signal that this is the ideology, this is the platform of the government to give up control and operation of major assets that traditionally perhaps the government has had. So there is this question of a demonstration effect that I think is very, very important. That quote is very, very interesting. If there is a private deal to be made, then it's already done. In other words, the government only thinks about PPPs or privatization if the private sector has not already done it. But there are a lot of things, particularly in Brazil, but in other countries as well, that the private sector has not done that the government thinks is important. And that is the point of departure for thinking about PPP as an alternative to having just letting the private sector go. This is what the government is, these are the government responsibilities at various times. And this morning you talked about the prison. It depends on what you're doing, which ones of these responsibilities the government is going to have and which ones it's going to allocate to the private sector. But the government is most likely going to delegate most of these vitally important functions to the private sector, to the private contractor. And think of that private sector contractor, theoretically anyway, and hopefully as a specialist, someone who has an expertise. And so you're going to let them build it. You're going to let them design what it is you're going to do. It may be a government-owned asset that's underperforming, and so you turn to the private sector to rehabilitate it for one reason or another. And then, of course, the important part about financing it, because the government has deficits and it wants to see that the money for whatever it is you're trying to do is going to come not from the public sector, not from the taxpayer, but from the private financial sector. And of course, then you operate it. But what's not down here is, again, just to be clear, is that there's no ownership transfer here over the long term. And I think that that has to be kept in mind. So what about the role of the government then? If they're going to cede to the private contractor all those other responsibilities, what's the government's responsibilities? And let me just give you a hint here about what I just said a few minutes ago. Why do PPPs so often fail, even though they make such good sense on so many different levels? Why don't they succeed? And it's incorporated in this state capacity to do what it's supposed to do. And so you may contract out to the private sector to do something, but you really have to be able to do certain things well for it to work. So first you have to build good contracts that include certain risk sharing, burden sharing between the private sector and the public sector. And it has to include enforceable penalties when the private contractor underperforms. But in order for you to enforce those penalties when the private contractor underperforms, you have to have a very effective government monitoring process to ensure that the private contractor is in full compliance with what they say they're going to do. And if they do not comply, that they are held accountable, that there are penalties, and therefore that there is real risk sharing between the government and the private sector. And when we find, and it's often, that PPPs fail, and we'll see an example of that this afternoon when we talk about Taiwan, a highly developed country, it is because the government doesn't do a very good job of what I just said. They don't build a good contract, and then they don't enforce it very effectively. The penalties are not clear, and so the private contractor is not sufficiently motivated because the penalties are not clear, and they have this feeling that they're not going to be held fully accountable. And almost every time we see a PPP that is not successful, this is where it starts with the government not being able to monitor and enforce the contract that it has written. And keep that in mind this afternoon when we talk, for example, about Taiwan high-speed rail, and when we talk about the Indonesia case. And no matter what PPP you look at, if it isn't successful, this is where you begin to look. It starts with the government's lack of capacity, for one reason or another, to do what it says it's going to do. So the rule of law is critical to this process. A PPP is very what I would call contract intensive. It's legally intensive. PPPs depend very, very heavily on the quality of the contract that is written between the government and the private contractor. And it takes a long time. It's very, very specific. And it includes, if it's done correctly, very clearly what the division of responsibility between the government and the private sector is, but more importantly, it includes how the government is going to monitor private sector performance and what those penalties will be in the event that the private contractor is not in full compliance with the contract. And that sounds, in the textbook sense, very straightforward, very simple, but think about your government, any government, whether it's a state government, a municipal government, a federal government, and think about whether they have the capacity to do what I just said. If they have the expertise internally within the government to do what I just said. And the answer often, unfortunately, is they don't. And this is where the whole concept tends to break down. And so this contract is very, very important, and the government's capacity to effectively enforce the contract and impose penalties and hold the private sector accountable for specified results is critically important and is often where the problems reside. The stakeholders, when we talk about PPPs, obviously they're very project specific, they're very industry specific. So this morning we were talking about a prison, and we know who the stakeholders were there. If we were talking about a high-speed rail transportation system, you'd have a different set of stakeholders. But the government's task is to understand who is going to support this PPP, who is going to oppose this PPP, and how you are going to generate political support for whatever it is you're trying to do. And so we talked this morning, and we've talked before about, for example, the labor unions. The labor unions in the prison system are a very, very forceful interest group that you have to take into consideration. Obviously, different private companies have different interests. But within the government, there are also stakeholders that have a different view on the value and the justification for a particular PPP arrangement. And so if you're talking, for example, about electricity PPP or water PPP, it only is going to be effective if you have an effective regulatory authority. You can have a great PPP and it can make perfect sense and you can do everything right, but if you don't have an effective regulatory framework and good enforcement of those regulations, it's going to fail. And your private sector contractor is going to know it, how to get around the regulations. So this again gets back to government capacity, state capacity. You have to be, especially with public goods, you have to have a very effective regulatory framework with enforcement capability and credibility with the private contractor. And this often is one of the biggest problems. And then the development finance institutions, we haven't talked very much about them. We've talked about a little bit about the World Bank, but there are many, whether it's a BNEDS or the World Bank or the Inter-American Development Bank or whomever. They not only are a financier of many of these projects, which is important. But they also have a lot of expertise in structuring these PPPs. And if you see around the world, you see the role, for example, of the World Bank. It has tremendous engineering, financial, structuring type of expertise that can be critically important to getting it right. And so they often serve as advisors to a government, and they are the ones that, based on their experience elsewhere, are able to assist the government to ensure that the structure of the PPP is feasible. So I would say that they're a major stakeholder in this, and they're someone that should be relied upon. Project finance. Again, a term that is confusing and often misunderstood. And what we mean, for those who may not know what this term means, is that the financier, those who are financing the project, their recourse in the event of failure or underperformance is not to the parent company, but to the project itself. So they are at risk with the project, which means, in other words, that the project, the PPP project, let's take a toll road, for example, it must generate sufficient cash flow to cover all of its operating costs and service its debt and still generate a profit for the private contractor. But the recourse of the financier is not to the parent company, maybe a construction company, but to that specific project and not beyond. So if something goes wrong, you do not have recourse to the parent company. And in all project finance, this concept is very, very important. And what it usually motivates the financier, the bankers, and the other investors to look very, very carefully at the project viability, its feasibility financially, because they are at risk with that particular project, the toll road, the electricity generating plant, or what have you. They're not at risk with the parent company. And keep that in mind when you think about this afternoon when we talk about Taiwan, because this is one of the I don't want to give away the case, but this was one of the flaws with the structure, which is that the banks had guarantees that made them do less due diligence when it came to financing the project. So making sure that the financier is at risk with the project, which is what makes that financier do serious due diligence and be much more careful about financing the project, is a critical factor for success. And so we will talk about that in both of the PPPs we're going to look at later this week, this afternoon and Thursday. This is a very, very important point. Where does the risk lie in the case of underperformance, the financial risk? I think most of you are familiar with this. These are the sources of finance for PPPs. We didn't get into this morning because there was no real equity involved. But if you're talking about infrastructure finance, like a railroad or like a bus terminal, you are going to have equity or investment in the project, even if it's not control. And that equity could come from the government, it could come from private investors, it could come from private equity investors, but you have the financial structure includes a certain amount of equity in the balance sheet. And then, of course, you have lots of debt. Depending on the project, it comes from banks, it comes from supplier credits, it may come from the government and government financial institutions, which may be providing a subsidy or may be providing loans. I mean, the BNDES, for example, is a major, major supplier of credit to an awful lot of PPPs in Brazil at below market interest rates. And this is a very, very important source of finance in Brazil for PPPs and other development finance institutions. The World Bank, IADB often are major providers of finance. And finally, I want to talk about this very complicated diagram because I think it's critical. This has not much to do with what you talked about earlier this morning about prisons. But if you're talking about project finance, doing a capital-intensive, very expensive physical infrastructure project. It could be a hydroelectric dam, it could be a railroad, it could be electric generating plant, or what have you. What we talk about when we talk about a project finance is creating what we call a special purpose vehicle, an SPV. And that special purpose vehicle is effectively the owner of the project. And so it's not the people above the SPP, maybe a construction company that wants to bid. In Brazil, you had a number of cases where construction companies bid to build and operate something in Brazil, whether it was an airport or a road. And that construction company bid to the government and won the contract. And then that construction company, I'm using it as an example, the parent, we'll call that the parent, they create an SPV. And this gets back to the concept of non-recourse. So if this project goes bad and that road or that airport doesn't perform and cannot repay its financiers, those financiers do not have recourse to the construction company that won the bid. They only have recourse to the special purpose vehicle that was created. And so this is a very, very important way for the financiers and the company to balance accountability. And it's a very important concept. So the SPV, rather than the parent company, owns the concession. And this is something you really have to understand. So, excuse me, that SPV owns one asset, the airport, or whatever it is, excuse me. So where does the money come from? The money is going to come from various different sources, but what's important to understand is that the money is not going to that parent company, it's going to the SPV, that one asset company. Think of it as a one asset company. And so you have a variety of different sources of finance, and they're all important. And so you have the banks, you have the banks will provide loans to the SPV, and they will be paid back by the revenues generated from that SPV, not from the construction company parent. They will be paid back by the debt service from the revenues that come. The equity investors are the same way. They are going to invest in this project and and get shares in return. And just like any stock, their return is going to be based on the performance of that SPV, how well it performs. And if it does not perform well, they're not going to make any money. And remember that the equity holders, in terms of if you have bankruptcy, they're the last to get any money back. They're more at risk than the lenders in that sense. The contractors also, they provide services to the SPV to build the asset, and they in turn get repaid in fees from the SPV. The operator, who is going to operate the facility once it is completely built, they also will provide a service, and they get paid back from the SPV, and only to the extent that the SPV or the asset performs the way it's supposed to, and so forth. What is the point of this? The point of this is that the stakeholders who are involved in building, financing, and operating this are at risk with the SPV, the performance of that particular entity. They're not at risk with the parent. And that's a very, very important concept that has to be followed, that they have to there has to be performance in order for them to get paid. And that's the ultimate of accountability, and I think it's very, very important. And so all these are stakeholders that are directly connected to the performance of the underlying asset, which is controlled by this special purpose vehicle, which in effect owns one and only one asset. And this is really the structure that I think is sometimes ignored when you think about how this works. Now, when we talked this afternoon about Taiwan high-speed rail, pay particular attention to how it was financed. And this type of a structure was not followed. And ask yourself, I'm not going to give away the answer, but it's going to be fairly obvious. If, for example, the lenders in this particular, the upper left-hand corner, if the lenders are not getting paid back by the SPV, but by the parent, ask yourself how motivated they are to do the due diligence on the SPV, on the project itself. And the answer, of course, is not as motivated because they're not at risk with the performance of that entity, the SPV. And that often is the fatal flaw. So I really, just to summarize, there are two basic problems with PPPs that are not fully appreciated. One is the financing and the fact, and whether or not those who are financing the project are accountable to the project itself, if it's project finance or not. But if they don't have recourse, if they have recourse to someone other than the SPV, it's risky. It's very, very risky. The second is this whole question about government capacity. And in sum, I would just simply say that PPPs often make excellent sense. There's good rationale for doing it. To save money, to enhance efficiency, to get more specialization, doing things that are public goods that are important for the public and for the government. There are lots of very, very good reasons to do this. But you have to ask yourself why they more often than not do not succeed. And the answer oftentimes is the government's capacity to write effective contracts, ensure there is compliance by the private contractor, that there are good penalties, and that there is good accountability. And this depends on the government's ability to effectively monitor that private sector concessionaire, which is a very, very challenging thing for most governments to do. And so that's where it all falls apart more often than not. And that's basically the ABCs, the PPP 101. I don't know if you have any questions about this. We're going to talk about it in much more detail starting this afternoon, but we can